A mother wakes up in the hospital and discovers that the biggest danger wasn't her heart attack, but her own son. Behind hugs and sweet words, he was hiding a dirty debt and a plan to accelerate his inheritance. In the silent early morning hours, he reduced her oxygen and whispered that it was the end. But she was prepared, and her reaction forever changed the family's destiny. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The constant beeping of machines was the only sound filling the hospital room when Barbara Mitchell opened her eyes. The 58-year-old businesswoman tried to orient herself in that sterile, antiseptic environment. The white walls, the smell of alcohol and medications, the rough sheet over her body, everything confirmed that she had survived the discomfort she had felt during a business meeting the previous afternoon. The mild heart attack had been a scare, but also a warning. Barbara breathed deeply, feeling a twinge in her chest. The doctors had been clear. She would need to completely change her lifestyle, abandon the stress of 14-hour workdays, take better care of her diet, and exercise regularly. For a woman who had built a business empire practically by herself, these changes sounded like a much greater challenge than any negotiation she had ever faced. A middle-aged nurse entered the room, checked the monitors, and smiled when she noticed Barbara was awake. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. How are you feeling today?" "Like someone who received a warning from their own body," replied Barbara, trying to adjust herself in the bed. "When can I go home?" "Dr. Richard wants to keep you under observation for at least 3 days. Your condition is stable, but we need to make sure there are no complications." Barbara sighed, resigned. 3 days away from the company she managed, with an iron fist, seemed like an eternity. She immediately thought of Sarah, her youngest daughter, who would certainly be worried. Sarah had followed a completely different path from hers, becoming a doctor instead of joining the family business. Barbara always respected her choice, although she secretly wished her daughter were closer, helping her manage the family's assets. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the room opened again. To her surprise, it was Eric, her oldest son, who entered. "Mom!" Eric exclaimed, quickly approaching the bed. His eyes were red as if he hadn't slept during the night. "Thank God you're okay. When I found out what happened, I dropped everything and came immediately." Barbara observed her son with curiosity. Eric, at 35, was a handsome man with features that strongly resembled her late husband, but there was something different about him that morning. A poorly disguised anxiety, an exaggerated care that didn't match the distant relationship they had maintained for years. "You didn't need to worry so much, Eric," replied Barbara, studying her son's reactions. "It was just a scare. The doctor said that with proper care I'll be good as new in a few weeks." "Don't say that, Mom. It was a heart attack. We can't underestimate the severity of the situation." Eric took Barbara's hand between his own. "Promise that you'll follow all the medical recommendations. We need you." The "we" sounded strange to Barbara's ears. In the last 5 years, Eric had practically disappeared from her life, showing up only for obligatory family lunches on holidays. Since he had taken over the management of one of the company's branches, he had become increasingly independent and distant. Phone calls were rare, visits even more so. And now, suddenly, he was expressing a concern that bordered on desperation. "I'm surprised to see you here so early," Barbara commented, trying to keep a casual tone. "I thought you'd be busy with the Atlanta branch." "Nothing is more important than you, Mom." Eric adjusted the pillow under Barbara's head with forced delicacy. "I asked Jason to take over temporarily. I'm going to stay here in Chicago until you're fully recovered." Barbara felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in her son's words, in the way his eyes didn't hold her gaze for long, that triggered an alert instinct she had developed over decades in the business world. "Has Sarah been notified?" "Yes, but you know how her shifts are. She said she'll come as soon as she can get away from the hospital." Eric walked to the window and partially opened the blinds, letting in the golden morning light. "I talked with Dr. Richard before coming in. He mentioned that it might be time for you to consider retirement." Barbara raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Retirement? He didn't mention anything about that when we talked yesterday." Eric turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's just a suggestion, Mom. You've worked so hard all these years. Maybe it's time to enjoy life, travel, rest. The company is well structured. I can take over the presidency while you enjoy the assets you've built." A warning light went off in Barbara's mind. In more than 3 decades at the helm of Mitchell Properties, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when someone was trying to manipulate her. It was like a sixth sense, a sharp intuition that rarely failed. And at that moment, this sense was screaming at maximum alert. "Let's leave this conversation for when I've recovered," replied Barbara, keeping her voice calm, despite the whirlwind of thoughts. "For now, I just need to rest." Of course, Eric quickly agreed, leaning in to kiss his mother's forehead. "I'll let you rest a bit. I'll be right outside if you need anything." When the door closed after her son's exit, Barbara allowed the mask of tranquility to fall. Something was deeply wrong with the whole situation. The excessive concern, the sudden mention of retirement, the rush to take over the company presidency, none of this was compatible with Eric's usual behavior. Trying to calm her thoughts, Barbara observed the room around her. On the nightstand next to the bed, her personal and corporate cell phones were charging. She picked up her personal device and sent a message to Sarah. "Sweetie, I know you're busy, but I need you to come as soon as possible. I'm not feeling good about some things that are happening here. Come as a doctor, not just as a daughter." After sending the message, Barbara leaned back on the pillows, pretending to rest. But her mind was working at full speed, analyzing every detail of Eric's strange behavior. Every word spoken, every forced gesture. Something was very wrong, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. The following hours passed. Slowly, Barbara observed the nurses coming and going, the doctor's visits, and noticed how Eric remained nearby, always solicitous, always attentive, a completely different version of the absent son she knew. And with each exaggeratedly careful gesture, each word too sweet, Barbara's suspicion grew. When night came, she made a decision. If she wanted to understand what was really happening, she would need to be smarter than her opponent, even if that opponent was her own son. Barbara closed her eyes, regulated her breathing, and pretended to be in a deep sleep. If Eric had something to hide, perhaps he would reveal himself when he believed he was alone. Barbara's strategy worked better than she had expected. Shortly after midnight, when movement in the hospital had decreased considerably, Eric returned to the room. Believing that his mother was sleeping deeply thanks to the medications, he settled into the armchair next to the window and took his cell phone from his pocket. Barbara maintained steady breathing, her eyes closed, but her ears were attentive to every movement, every whisper. Eric briefly looked in her direction, making sure she was asleep, and then began to speak on the phone in a low voice. "Yes, she's stable," he said in a conspiratorial tone. "No, I can't speed things up. It needs to appear natural, understand?" The doctor mentioned 3 days of observation, then medical discharge. Barbara felt her heart accelerate, but controlled her breathing to not reveal she was awake. Her son's conversation continued, revealing increasingly disturbing details. 15 days is the most I can wait. The guys have already given me an ultimatum. No, you don't understand the gravity of the situation. I owe almost 2 million. If I don't pay, you know what can happen." A brief silence followed, while Eric apparently listened to the interlocutor's response. "The plan is simple. As soon as she's discharged, I'll convince her to update the will. I'll say it's a precaution after the scare we had. She trusts me. Now thinks I'm concerned about her health. With the updated will, the rest resolves naturally. No one will suspect anything." Barbara felt a chill run through her body. Her own son was planning something terrible against her, motivated by debts and desperation. The revelation was so shocking that for a moment she almost gave away that she was awake, almost confronted him directly. But years of difficult negotiations had taught her that information was the most powerful weapon. And now she needed more information. Eric ended the call, remained silent for a few minutes, and then quietly left the room. Only when the door closed did Barbara allow herself to open her eyes. Her breathing was irregular, her hands trembling. The betrayal was too deep, too painful to be processed immediately, but there was no time for lamentations. She needed to act, and quickly. Careful not to make noise, Barbara took her cell phone and sent a new message to Sarah. "Come immediately." "Don't trust anything," Eric says. "Bring your friend Michael, that lawyer. Serious situation." The rest of the night was an exercise in self-control. Barbara alternated between moments of disbelief, anger, and a deep sadness that threatened to consume her. How could her own son, the one she had raised with so much love, plot something so terrible? What kind of debt had led him to such desperation? And why had he never asked for help directly? When the sun began to rise, tinting the sky with pink, tones visible through the hospital window, Barbara had already devised a plan. It wouldn't be easy and would require an emotional strength that she didn't know if she possessed, but it was necessary. Not just for her own protection, but also to discover how far Eric was willing to go. Dr. Richard arrived early for his morning visit. Barbara received him with rehearsed serenity, as if nothing had happened during the night. "How are you feeling?" "Today, Mrs. Mitchell?" asked the doctor, checking the chart. "Better, doctor, but I'd like to ask some specific questions." Barbara adjusted herself in the bed, instinctively assuming the executive posture she used in important meetings. "Did you mention to my son that I should consider retirement?" The doctor looked confused. "No, I didn't mention anything like that. I recommended stress reduction and lifestyle changes, but we never talked about retirement." Barbara nodded, confirming her suspicions. "And about my health condition, what's the real prognosis?" "It was a mild heart attack, Mrs. Mitchell. With proper care and some habit changes, I don't see why you shouldn't lead a completely normal and productive life for many years." This information was both a relief and a confirmation. Eric was lying, manipulating medical information for his own ends. The web of lies grew with each new discovery. "Doctor, can I make an unusual request?" Barbara lowered her voice, making sure that no one besides the doctor could hear her. "I'd like you not to discuss my case with my son, Eric. Only with me and with my daughter, Sarah, who is a doctor and should arrive today." Dr. Richard looked intrigued, but nodded. "Of course. Medical confidentiality is your right. I'll only speak with whom you authorize." After the doctor left, Barbara didn't have much time to reorganize her thoughts. Eric entered the room carrying a bouquet of flowers and a box of fine chocolates, her favorites. "Good morning, Mom. I brought your favorites." He placed the gift on the nightstand and kissed Barbara's forehead with false affection. "How are you feeling today?" Barbara forced a smile. If she wanted to discover more about her son's plans, she would need to play his game. "Better, son. I think the scare has passed." "That's good." Eric sat on the edge of the bed, taking his mother's hand between his. There was a calculating gleam in his eyes that Barbara had never noticed before, or perhaps had never wanted to see. "I've been thinking, Mum. With this scare we had, maybe it's time to put some matters in order." "What kind of matters?" asked Barbara, feigning innocence. "You know, practical issues. Your will, for example. Is it updated?" The last revision was more than 5 years ago. "The company's assets have grown, we've acquired new properties. It's important to ensure everything is organized." Barbara felt a knot in her stomach, but maintained a neutral expression. "I don't think this is the time to talk about this, Eric. I just had a health scare." "Precisely because of that, Mom." Eric gently squeezed her hand in a gesture that should convey affection, but that Barbara now interpreted as manipulation. "We never know what might happen. It's better to be prepared." Before Barbara needed to elaborate a response, the door to the room opened, and Sarah hurriedly entered. The 32-year-old doctor seemed to have traveled all night. Deep, dark circles marked her usually radiant face, and her hair was tied in a disheveled bun. "Mom!" Sarah ran to hug Barbara, momentarily ignoring her brother's presence. "I came as soon as I could. How are you?" Barbara felt genuine tears spring to her eyes. Her daughter's presence represented safety amidst the emotional chaos of the last few hours. "I'm much better now that you're here." Sarah then turned to her brother, offering a quick hug. "Eric, good that you're here too. Can we talk outside?" "For a minute." Eric seemed momentarily disconcerted but agreed. "Sure, let's let Mom rest a bit." As soon as the children left, Barbara allowed herself a moment of relief. Sarah had understood the urgency of her message and responded promptly. Now they needed to act with intelligence and discretion. Minutes later, Sarah returned alone to the room. Her face was pale, and there was a seriousness in her expression that Barbara rarely saw. "I talked briefly with Eric," said Sarah, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "He seemed strange to me, very concerned with practical matters for someone whose mother just had a cardiac problem." Barbara took her daughter's hand. "We need to talk, Sarah, but not here, not now. Eric could return at any moment. I need you to speak with Dr. Richard, get all the details of my condition. And I also need you to contact Michael urgently." "Michael is already on his way," replied Sarah, concern evident in her voice. "Mom, what's happening?" "Your messages terrified me." Barbara hesitated. Telling the truth now would be too painful, both for her and for Sarah, who had always idolized her older brother. "Trust me, honey. As soon as Michael arrives, I'll explain everything. For now, I need you to act as my doctor, not just as my daughter. Observe, analyze, question, especially anything related to my treatment and my condition." Sarah nodded, confused but determined. Years of medical practice had taught her to maintain composure, even in the most critical situations. "I'll talk to Dr. Richard right away." When the door closed after Sarah's exit, Barbara allowed herself a moment of weakness. The tears she had contained finally rolled down her face. The pain of betrayal was indescribable, like an open wound that pulsed with each beat of her fragile heart. But there was no time for prolonged lamentations. If she wanted to protect herself and the heritage she had built over decades, she would need to be stronger than ever. Michael Johnson arrived at the hospital in the early afternoon, carrying a black leather folder and an expression of genuine concern. The 40-year-old lawyer was a close friend of Sarah's since college days and had become the Mitchell family's trusted legal consultant in recent years. Barbara always admired his integrity and discretion, essential qualities for what she needed from him now. Sarah led Michael to a small garden on the third floor of the hospital, an open space where patients usually sunbathed during recovery. It was a safe place to talk without the risk of being overheard, especially since Eric had momentarily gone out to resolve pending matters at the company, as he had justified. "Mrs. Mitchell, what a scare you gave us," Michael began, sitting on the bench next to her. "But I confess I'm confused about the urgency of this meeting. Sarah mentioned something about a new will." Barbara looked around, making sure they were truly alone, and then reported everything she had discovered in the last 24 hours. The phone conversation she had overheard, Eric's lies about her health condition, the sudden concern with the will. As she spoke, she saw Michael's face transform from confusion to shock, and finally to professional indignation. Sarah, meanwhile, remained silent, tears freely streaming down her face. For her, the revelation was doubly painful. Not only was her mother in danger, but her brother, the person she had admired most throughout her life, was responsible for that danger. "I can't believe it," Sarah finally spoke, her voice choked. "Eric was always so protective, so responsible. How could he reach this point?" "Gambling," replied Barbara, the pain evident in her voice. "I clearly heard when he mentioned a debt of $2 million. Apparently, he's involved with dangerous people." Michael shook his head, processing the information. "Mrs. Mitchell, if what you heard is true, and we have no reason to doubt, we are facing an extremely serious situation. We need to act on several fronts simultaneously." "That's why I called you too," replied Barbara, instinctively resuming the leadership posture that characterized her. "I need legal and medical protection." Michael opened his folder and took out some documents. "First, let's immediately prepare a new will. Not what Eric expects, obviously, but one that protects you and the assets you've built." "I want to exclude Eric from the succession," declared Barbara, her voice firm despite the pain this decision caused her. I know it seems drastic, but I can't risk it. He's lost my trust in an irreparable way." Sarah sobbed quietly, but didn't contest her mother's decision. The silence was a painful acknowledgement of the necessity of that extreme measure. "Legally, you have every right," confirmed Michael. "The Civil Code provides for disinheritance in cases of attempts against the life of the inheritance author. We'll need concrete evidence to sustain this judicially, but we can start with the new will immediately." Barbara nodded. "I want to transfer everything to Sarah. She has always demonstrated integrity, and although she has never been interested in the company, I know she'll do what's right." Sarah raised her eyes, surprised. "Mom, I don't know if I'm prepared for this. Mitchell Properties is a huge, complex company." "You're more capable than you think, honey. Besides, we have competent teams that can assist you in the transition. The important thing now is to ensure that the assets don't fall into Eric's hands, and consequently, those of these obscure creditors." Michael made some quick notes. "I'll prepare the document today and bring it for you to sign tomorrow, with trusted witnesses. But this is just the beginning. We need concrete evidence of Eric's intentions." It was then that Sarah, drying her tears and assuming a more professional posture, presented the second part of the plan. "As a doctor, I have some ideas. First, I've asked Dr. Richard to restrict visits outside regular hours. Eric won't be able to enter here during the night anymore." "He'll become suspicious," warned Barbara. "Probably," agreed Sarah. "But we'll say it's part of the standard protocol for cardiac patients. They need uninterrupted rest." Barbara considered the idea for a moment. "It might work temporarily, but if he's really desperate because of this debt, he'll eventually find a way to circumvent the rules." "Exactly," said Michael, leaning forward, "and that's where we can catch him. If Eric tries something concrete, we'll have definitive proof of his intentions." "Are you suggesting that I deliberately put myself at risk?" asked Barbara, arching an eyebrow. "Not at all," Sarah immediately replied. "We're suggesting that we create a controlled situation where Eric can reveal his intentions without you being in any real danger." Michael complimented the idea. "We can discreetly install monitoring equipment in your room. Nothing invasive, just enough to record conversations and movements. If Eric tries anything or makes any confession, we'll have it recorded." Barbara pondered the proposal for a few moments. It was risky but calculated, exactly the type of strategy she herself would use in a difficult business negotiation. "I agree, but with one condition. I want it to be quick. I can't bear this charade for long. With each false smile I have to give my own son, a part of me shatters." The trio discussed the practical details of the plan for the next few minutes. Michael would be responsible for the legal part, ensuring that the new will would be irrefutable. Sarah would coordinate with the medical team, making sure that Barbara was constantly monitored and protected. And Barbara, in turn, would maintain the act, pretending to suspect nothing, giving Eric the false sense that his plan was working. When they returned to the room, they found Eric waiting, an expression of false concern on his face. He smiled upon seeing Michael, extending his hand for a formal greeting. "Michael, good that you came. I was just thinking about calling you." Eric cast a quick glance at his mother. "We have some legal matters to discuss, considering Mom's health status." Michael maintained a neutral expression, years of courtroom experience serving him well in that moment. "Of course, Eric, but first I need to talk with your mother in private. Confidential client-attorney matters, you understand." Eric seemed momentarily displeased but recovered quickly. "Certainly, I'll take the opportunity to get some coffee. Sarah, would you like to join me?" Sarah hesitated, looking at her mother. The last place she wanted to be was alone with Eric, fearing that her expression or words might reveal what she now knew. But Barbara nodded discreetly. Part of the plan was to keep Eric unaware of their suspicions. "Sure, let's go," replied Sarah, forcing a smile. As soon as the siblings left, Michael turned to Barbara, speaking in a low voice. "He's anxious. Mrs. Mitchell, more than he appears. I saw it in his eyes when I mentioned our private conversation." "He's running out of time," replied Barbara, recalling the details of the phone conversation she had intercepted. "He mentioned a 15-day deadline to resolve his situation with the creditors." That gives us a short window to act, Michael made more notes in his planner. I'll return tomorrow with the documents. Meanwhile, I suggest that you avoid signing any paper Eric presents, even if it seems harmless. Barbara agreed. She knew deceptive business tactics well. After all, she had faced many in her career, and knew that seemingly innocent documents could contain dangerous clauses in fine print. "And what about Sarah?" asked Barbara, the concern evident in her voice. "She's devastated. Eric has always been her hero." Michael closed his folder, his expression solemn. "Her pain is understandable, but Sarah is strong, Mrs. Mitchell. Stronger than perhaps she herself knows, and now she has a clear purpose: to protect you." When Michael left, Barbara remained alone for a few minutes, contemplating the unimaginable situation in which she found herself. How had they reached this point? Where had she failed in raising Eric? She had always believed she had provided her children not only with material comfort, but with solid values. What could have led her firstborn to such desperation to the point of considering? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again. Eric entered alone, which immediately put Barbara on alert. "Where's Sarah?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "She ran into a medical colleague and stayed to chat," replied Eric, sitting on the edge of the bed. There was a barely contained nervousness in his gestures. "Mom, we need to talk about something important." Barbara breathed deeply, preparing herself mentally. "What is it, son?" "It's about the future of the company. With this health situation, perhaps it's prudent to start thinking about a more structured leadership transition." Eric spoke carefully, choosing his words as if he were in a delicate negotiation. "I've been closely monitoring the operations. I know every detail. It would be a natural transition." Barbara studied her son's face, that same face she had kissed countless times as a child, to whom she had told bedtime stories, whom she had taught the first steps in business. It was painful to see the cold ambition that now inhabited his eyes. "Eric, I always knew you would eventually take over the presidency," replied Barbara, measuring each word. "But I don't think this is the time to discuss it. The doctors said my recovery will be complete." Of course," Eric hurried to agree, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his anxiety. "I'm just thinking about your well-being. Less stress, more tranquility. You could continue as chairwoman of the board, a more strategic and less operational position." Barbara recognized the tactic. It was the same one she herself had used decades ago to gently remove older partners who no longer contributed significantly to the business. The irony of the situation almost made her smile bitterly. "Let's talk about this when I get out of here," replied Barbara, feigning a yawn. "I'm a little tired now." Eric nodded, standing up. "Rest, Mom. I'll be around if you need anything." When he leaned in to kiss her forehead, Barbara needed all her willpower not to recoil. Her son's lips' touch on her skin now carried a veiled threat that only she perceived. As soon as Eric left, Barbara took her cell phone and sent a quick message to Michael. "We need to accelerate the plan. The situation is worsening." The next morning, the plan was in full swing. Michael returned to the hospital carrying the new will documents, accompanied by 2 trusted employees from his office who would serve as witnesses. Sarah, in turn, had coordinated with Dr. Richard the discreet installation of a small camera in the room, positioned to capture the entire area around Barbara's bed. Eric appeared normal, but Barbara, who had known him since birth, could perceive the subtle signs of nervousness: the way he drummed his fingers on his leg when he thought no one was looking, the slight sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning, the frequent glances at his cell phone. "Good morning." "Mom," Eric greeted, entering the room with another bouquet of flowers. "I brought your favorites. How are you feeling today?" "Better every day," replied Barbara, forcing a smile. "Dr. Richard said I might be discharged tomorrow if the tests remain stable." A shadow of concern crossed Eric's face. "So soon? Wouldn't it be better to stay a few more days under observation?" "Staying in a hospital increases the risk of hospital infections," intervened Sarah, who had just entered the room. "Mom will be better at home, following the prescribed treatment." Eric cast an irritated look at his sister, but quickly recomposed his expression. Of course, I'm just concerned. It's natural." "Your concern is touching, son," commented Barbara, each word loaded with an irony that only Sarah could perceive. "But I fully trust your sister's medical opinion." A silent tension hung in the air for a few seconds until Michael's arrival broke the heavy atmosphere. "Good morning, everyone," greeted the lawyer, placing his folder on the table near the window. "Mrs. Mitchell, I brought those documents we discussed yesterday." Eric immediately approached, his interest poorly disguised. "What documents?" "Some adjustments to my will," replied Barbara calmly, observing her son's reaction. "As you yourself suggested, Eric, it's prudent to keep everything in order after this health scare." Eric's face momentarily lit up. "Excellent idea, Mom. Can I help in any way?" Michael intervened with studied naturalness. "Actually, Eric, I need to speak with your mother in privacy. Confidential matters between attorney and client, you understand." "But," Eric began to protest, but Barbara interrupted him. "Son, why don't you take the opportunity to go to the apartment and bring those more comfortable clothes I mentioned? If I'm really going to be discharged tomorrow, I'll need them." Eric hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave at that crucial moment. "I can ask the housekeeper to set them aside and send them." "I prefer that you choose them yourself," insisted Barbara. "You've always had good taste for these things." After several more frustrated attempts to stay, Eric finally yielded, promising to return in a few hours. As soon as the door closed behind him, Barbara, Sarah, and Michael exchanged looks of relief. "He's anxious," commented Michael, opening his folder, "almost desperate to know the contents of the new will." "And he'll become even more so when he discovers it's not what he expects," replied Barbara, a mixture of sadness and determination in her voice. "Let's proceed." The next 30 minutes were dedicated to formalizing the new will. The document was clear. Barbara Mitchell, in full use of her mental faculties, disinherited her son, Eric Mitchell, for reasons that would be explained in a confidential attachment. All her personal assets and her shares in Mitchell Properties would pass to her daughter, Sarah Mitchell, with the condition that she maintain the family's business legacy and ensure that the longest-serving employees would be protected in any future restructuring. After the signatures and formal acknowledgement by the witnesses, Michael carefully stored the documents. "I'll register this in the notary's office today. The will shall be legally validated before nightfall." "And now?" asked Sarah, the tension evident in her voice. "How do we prove Eric's intentions?" Barbara breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the decision they had made. "Now comes the hardest part. We need to give Eric an opportunity to completely reveal himself." The plan was risky, but necessary. Barbara would inform Eric, when he returned, that she had updated her will as suggested, leaving him as the primary heir and future company president. The news, they hoped, would give him the false security necessary to proceed with whatever plan he had in mind, believing that the path to the family's assets was open. Sarah initially disagreed, concerned about the risks. "What if he tries something immediately?" "We can't underestimate him, Mom." "You won't be alone at any time," Michael assured. "Besides, the hospital's security team has been discreetly alerted. At the slightest sign of danger, they'll intervene." The following hours passed slowly. Barbara alternated between moments of cold determination and instances of profound sadness. As a mother, she felt she had terribly failed. As a businesswoman, she recognized the need to protect the legacy she had built over decades. The internal conflict was devastating. Eric returned in the middle of the afternoon, carrying a small suitcase with the requested clothes. There was a different gleam in his eyes, a restlessness he couldn't completely disguise. "I brought everything you asked for, Mom," he said, placing the suitcase in a corner. "Has Michael already left?" Barbara nodded. "Yes, we finished all the paperwork. You were right, Eric. It was important to update the will." Eric sat on the edge of the bed, trying to appear casual. "And may I ask what you decided?" "Nothing. Very different from what was already planned," replied Barbara, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "You will take over the company presidency when I retire. which will now be sooner than we imagined. The assets will go mostly to you, with a smaller portion for Sarah, since she never showed interest in the business. The relief on Eric's face was almost palpable. His shoulders visibly relaxed, and a genuine smile, the first in days, appeared on his lips. Wise decision, Mom. I promise to honor your legacy and make the company grow even more. I'm sure you will, replied Barbara, carefully studying each of her son's reactions. Michael mentioned that the document will be officially registered by the end of the day. Eric discreetly checked his watch. Excellent. And what about your discharge? Is it still scheduled for tomorrow? Yes, if the latest tests remain stable. Barbara made a calculated pause before adding, speaking of tests, Sarah requested some additional ones for tonight. Something about monitoring my oxygen levels during sleep. I see, Eric murmured, a slight furrowing of his brows betraying his concern with this unexpected information. And will she be here during these tests? It won't be necessary. The equipment records everything automatically. Barbara adjusted herself in the bed, feigning tiredness. Actually, I'm a bit exhausted now. I think I'll rest a bit before dinner. Eric promptly stood up. Of course, rest, Mum. I'll return later to see how you're doing. When he left, Barbara exchanged meaningful looks with Sarah, who had been sitting silently in a corner of the room during the entire conversation. He took the bait, whispered Barbara. Sarah approached, checking her mother's vital signs on the monitor beside the bed. I'm scared, Mom. His look when you mentioned the night tests. That's why we need to be prepared, replied Barbara, holding her daughter's hand. Michael is on his way with the original will document. He'll hand it to you before leaving. Keep it in a safe place. The following hours were tense. Barbara pretended to be asleep when Eric returned for a quick visit after dinner. Sarah remained at the hospital, sometimes in the room with her mother, sometimes talking with the nurses at the nearby station, ensuring everyone was alert but discreet. Michael returned as arranged, giving Sarah the original, properly registered will. Everything is ready, he confirmed. Security has been discreetly reinforced. There's a plainclothes guard in the hallway, and the nurses are on alert. Around 11 p.m., Sarah pretended to leave, saying goodbye to her mother in a way that Eric, who was in the corridor, could see. In reality, she merely went around the corner and entered a nearby room where she could monitor the images from the camera installed in Barbara's room. Barbara, in turn, prepared herself for the most difficult night of her life. She took her medications and adjusted the bed to a comfortable position. The plan was simple: pretend to be deeply asleep and see how far Eric would go. The wait was agonizing. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The hospital grew increasingly quiet, with only the occasional sounds of equipment and the distant footsteps of the night staff. At 3:17 a.m., the door to the room opened silently. Barbara maintained regular breathing, closed eyes, a relaxed body. Through her half-closed eyelids, she could see Eric's silhouette carefully entering, closing the door behind him. He approached the bed slowly, observing her for long moments, to make sure she was sleeping deeply. Then, with precise movements, he headed for the oxygen equipment next to the bed. Barbara felt her heart racing, but maintained controlled breathing. This was the decisive moment, the instant when her son would reveal his true intentions. Part of her still desperately hoped he would back away, that some remnant of conscience would prevent him from proceeding. But Eric didn't hesitate. With meticulous care, he adjusted the oxygen flow, reducing it to a level that, maintained for long enough, would be dangerously low. Not enough to cause an immediate crisis, but sufficient to provoke a gradual deterioration that would appear natural. It was at this moment that Barbara opened her eyes. "Eric," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "what are you doing?" The son froze, his hand still on the equipment, his eyes wide with panic. "Mom, I was just checking if everything was all right." "Don't lie to me," replied Barbara, sitting up in bed. "Not this time." The silence that followed was charged with an almost palpable tension. Eric seemed torn between fleeing and trying to maintain the charade. "Why? asked Barbara, her voice now choked with contained emotion. "Why do this to your own blood?" Eric took a step back, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "You wouldn't understand. Try to explain it to me. I owe you at least that much, don't I? A chance to justify yourself before everything falls apart." Something in Barbara's calmness seemed to destabilize Eric even more. He expected screams, panic, accusations, not this almost supernatural serenity. "I'm ruined," he finally confessed, his voice low and broken. "I owe more money than you can imagine. These aren't just common debts, Mom. They're dangerous people who don't accept negotiations or delays." "And you thought the solution was to eliminate me?" asked Barbara, each word laden with pain. Eric looked away, unable to directly face the accusation. "I had no choice. They threatened my family, my children. I tried everything. Bank loans, selling personal assets, even diverting resources from the branch. Nothing was enough." "You could have asked for my help," said Barbara, tears finally escaping. "I'm your mother. I've always been here." "And admit that I failed," Eric laughed bitterly. "That the prodigal son, the perfect heir, had an addiction that consumed him from the inside. That he bet millions on online games while pretending to be the exemplary executive. You would destroy me, remove me from the company." Barbara slowly shook her head. "You don't really know me, son. You never have." At that moment, the door to the room opened. Sarah entered, followed by Michael and 2 hospital security guards. Eric's face paled as he realized the trap he had fallen into. "It's all recorded." "Eric," said Sarah, her voice trembling with emotion. "The equipment manipulation, the confession, everything." "You—" Eric looked from one to the other, understanding slowly forming on his face. "You planned this." "We were forced to," replied Barbara, exhaustion finally showing in her voice. "You left us no choice." The security guards approached Eric, who offered no resistance. He seemed strangely relieved, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders with the revelation of the truth. "What happens now?" he asked, looking at his mother. Barbara exchanged a look with Michael, who nodded slightly. "That depends on you, Eric. We have 2 options. The first involves the police, formal accusations, a criminal process that will destroy not only your reputation, but will also affect your children who are not guilty of your choices." Eric swallowed hard, waiting. "The second option is an agreement," Barbara continued, resuming the negotiator tone that had made her famous in the business world. "You sign a document renouncing any right to the inheritance and the company. You agree to undergo intensive treatment for your gambling addiction in a specialized clinic. Afterwards, you leave the country. You start a new life far from here, with a monthly allowance sufficient to live with dignity, but without luxuries. In exchange, we keep this episode confidential." "And my children?" asked Eric, his voice almost inaudible. "They'll be fine," assured Barbara. "I'll ensure they have everything they need. Education, health, opportunities, but you'll only be able to see them under supervision until you successfully complete treatment." Eric remained silent for long moments, processing the options. Finally, he slowly nodded. "I accept your terms, not for the money, but for my children. They don't deserve to bear the weight of my mistakes." The next morning, Barbara was discharged from the hospital. As Sarah helped her with the bags, Dr. Richard entered for a final visit. "How do you feel, Mrs. Mitchell?" he asked, checking her vital signs one last time. "Physically better," she replied with a tired smile. "Emotionally, that will take longer." The doctor nodded understandingly. Emotional traumas often leave deeper scars than physical ones. "But you have a wonderful daughter by your side. That makes all the difference." Barbara looked at Sarah, who was organizing the medications on the small table. "Yes, I do. And only now do I fully realize how precious that is." On the way out of the hospital, a nurse who had helped during the decisive night approached discreetly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I just wanted to say I admire you greatly. Your strength, your dignity in the face of everything that happened." Barbara gently held the nurse's hand. "What's your name, dear?" "Amy," replied the young woman, surprised by the Question. Amy, you were a fundamental part of this story. If you ever need anything in the future, don't hesitate to contact me. Days later, Barbara sat in her home office, looking out through the panoramic window that overlooked the city she loved so much. Eric was already admitted to a specialized clinic, the renunciation documents duly signed and registered. The revised will ensure that Sarah would assume total control of the family assets. Sarah entered the office silently, carrying 2 cups of tea. How are you feeling today? Barbara smiled at her daughter. Better. Each day a little better. Mom, Sarah, sat in the chair in front of the desk, hesitant. I've been thinking a lot about the company. I know I never showed interest in the business before, but, Barbara encouraged, perceiving a change in her daughter. But maybe it's time to learn. I don't need to completely abandon medicine. I can reduce my hours at the hospital. The company is your legacy, the work of your life. I don't want that to be lost. Barbara felt a deep emotion upon hearing these words. After so much pain, a new beginning was announcing itself, not as she had imagined, but perhaps exactly as it should be. It would be an honor to teach you, replied Barbara, extending her hand to her daughter. We can start slowly without... Hurry! Sarah held her mother's hand, her eyes shining with determination. I'll do my best, I promise. I know you will, replied Barbara, feeling for the first time in many days truly hopeful about the future. We've been through a terrible storm, honey, but now finally I see the sun beginning to appear again. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that Barbara and her family's story has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of intense emotions, we have prepared a special list with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like to the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and